Energy Media readers, today's Zoffee features Josipa Petrunic from CUTRIC, and we're going to be talking about low carbon mobility and transportation in Canada. So welcome to the Zoffee, Josipa.
Thank you very much.
Now, why don't you give us a brief overview of what CUTRIC does? Because it's a fascinating organization. I think it's really important, the work that you're doing as we head into Canada's low carbon future.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. So CUTRIC stands for the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. It is a mouthful, but basically it summarizes what we do, which is we're a nonprofit that is national in scope, and we bring together industry members, utility members, academic members, and transit agencies, critically, in order to pursue one vision, which is to make Canada a leader in low carbon smart mobility technology innovation. So that means creating jobs in the green economy, specifically in mobility, anything that gets rid of emissions and pollution and makes mass mobility faster, cleaner, greener, and cheaper than individual passenger cars. That's what we do.
Well, we're going to get into exactly what you do in a little while, but I've got something I want to run past, and that is when I look at China, the United States, Germany, countries like that that have really extensive electric vehicle and electric vehicle industries, the big automakers that are switching over to electric. One of the things I notice is that most of those companies look at this very strategically. They say, not only are we going to electrify our transportation, but we want to use this opportunity to develop industries that will thrive and create jobs for us in this new low carbon mobility future. And is that part of your mandate, is to think about this strategically from an industrial and economic point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at projects in the electrification domain, it's not good enough for us to support a project to deploy electrified vehicles, say electric buses. There has to be components of the system that are designed, made, manufactured, innovated in Canada. So if the entire system is imported, that might be good for emissions, but it's not good for the Canadian worker. So our projects have to critically combine two things: reduce emissions to improve the air and climate change, and then secondly, create jobs in doing it to make Canadians rich off this new innovative technology. And one defining factor that I'd put out there is we don't really do projects, we don't do projects that promote single passenger cars. So there's lots of electric cars out there. I used to own a Nissan Leaf. I drank the Kool-Aid. I believe in it. But at the end of the day, designing individual passenger cars that are electrified is not where we focus our efforts. And in part in Canada, we kind of did miss the boat on that one anyhow. If you go historically back to 2008, 2009, during the post-recessionary period, or the immediate recessionary period, that's when the Obama administration pumped a lot of money into Michigan and the automotive manufacturing jurisdictions of the US to better prepare them for electrification and autonomy. We didn't do the same thing in Canada at that time. So a lot of our auto sector is catching up now, 10 years later, to investments that Europe and the United States made in 2009, 2010, and 2011. By contrast, however, we do make electric buses. We do innovate electrified rail systems. We do make electrified coach systems in Canada. So the heavy duty platforms we do make here, from the Nova buses to the New Flyers, to the MCI and the Prevos, we do make those systems in Canada. So on the heavy duty side, there's a lot of jobs, and those jobs have been invested in over the last 10 years. It's just not as sexy as the automotive sector, which has long held sort of the label of manufacturing job creator and generator in Canada. And the pendulum's shifting over to the heavy duty side now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I've made the argument in columns that if you're a country like Canada, that yes, we have a domestic auto manufacturing sector, but really it's kind of a branch plant economy. It always has been, and we recognize that. So if you're looking at this new low carbon transportation, we're far better off, in my opinion, to look at niches, like you were saying, the heavy duty. Now that isn't as sexy, but in fact, if you invest there, I think, I don't know if there's any data to back this up, but I would imagine that if you're electrifying delivery vehicles, garbage trucks, long haul trucking, those kinds of things, you actually may have more of an impact on your national emissions than if you just simply subsidized everybody to have an electric car.
Yeah, I've not been an advocate of EV subsidies ever. And there's a reason for that. It's not that we speak against them, we just don't advocate for them because you're incentivizing car ownership, point blank. But on the flip side, if we incentivized innovation, research, development, and manufacturing, in particular, and commercialization in the heavy duty sector, there's a lot more wins to be had. So as you said, not as sexy because the job numbers aren't the same as the automotive sector. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in the automotive sector, tens of thousands of jobs in the heavy duty manufacturing sector. However, when you look at electrification, which includes both battery electrification and hydrogen fuel cell based electrification of heavy duty fleets in buses, coaches, and heavy duty trucks, then there's a whole systems play that is hundreds of thousands of jobs. So what do I mean by that? Well, look at some of the tier one auto companies, Magna, Linamar. They're making components in heavy duty truck electrification. What do they need to make big sales? They need truck fleets going electric. In order for truck fleets to go electric, both interregional and return to base kind of city delivery vehicles, you need the charging infrastructure. But the charging infrastructure for trucks and buses is completely different from the infrastructure for cars. And some of the innovators, Siemens, ABB, eCamion, that make those heavy duty electrification systems for trucks and coaches and buses are here in Canada. Their footprint is here in Canada. Over to the hydrogen side, same story. The Ballards, the Hydrogenics, now purchased by Cummins. Those players in the hydrogen sector are here in Canada. So when we talk about heavy duty electrification of transit, bus, and coach, what we're really talking about is not just the vehicle platform, which some of the automakers will benefit from, that tier one, tier two supply chain, but also the whole fueling and charging infrastructure that is already here and which is not primarily motivated or incentivized by automobile purchases, but is incentivized by fleet electrification deployments.
Do governments understand this strategy, Josipa? I mean, say the federal government, which I think is probably the biggest funder, I would imagine, of this kind of work, does it recognize that our strategy has, because of the structure of our industry and the size of our economy, that has to be different, and is it putting money into that approach?
I think, if you had asked me that question 5 years ago, the answer was no. Circa 2020, the answer is yes, but we have a lot more to go in terms of fully robustly developing that acknowledgement. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you take a look 5 years ago and still today, this is a problem federally and provincially. Our ministries are designed for the 20th century. If you look at Ministry of Economic Development, Ministry of Industry, as it was at the federal level, or Industry Canada, now ISED, and into that now its newest association, always it focused on automotive, rail, and aerospace. It did not look at transportation or mobility, right? So that was a problem, and that happened across the country. Then you look at energy, and energy at the provincial level has focused outside of Alberta and Newfoundland and certain petroleum producing jurisdictions, mostly just on electricity. And that's been completely distinct from transportation. You go over to the Ministry of Transportation, federally and provincially, and they focused on regulation or transit, right? Infrastructure and transportation, transit, but not innovation, commercialization, or new mobility. So there's a big black hole in the middle where what you actually need is a transportation energy ministry. You need a ministry of new mobility. So, today in 2020, yes, the federal ministries of innovation, economic development, infrastructure, natural resources understand that there's no longer a dividing line between the fueling and the energy system and the transportation deployment, the platform. So there's an increasing merger of those ministries at the federal level. Provincially, still a big problem. Our ministries that manage utilities are over there. Our ministries that manage infrastructure for transit are over there, and the two things do not talk. And if you're in Ontario, the ministry that manages automotive manufacture is way over there, and they generally don't talk. So we still have an ongoing problem with 20th century ministerial divisions, how our government is divided, and 21st century transportation energy needs, which is how we want ourselves as human beings and our freight to move in the future.
That's really interesting, because a lot of the work that I've read on new technology adoption, the new energy technology adoption, stresses the importance of the regulatory regime in the jurisdiction in question, because regulatory regimes can either enable and speed up adoption, or they can inhibit and slow down adoption. And it sounds like jurisdictions such as California, for instance, Texas on the wind side, well, it's not transportation, but then look at the Netherlands, for instance, which is way out in front of some of this stuff. And that gives them a competitive advantage because they get first mover advantage.
Right. So, I mean, I always get annoyed when folks say cut the red tape by cutting regulation. Some regulation creates a lot of jobs. Some regulation is the incentive for job creation. So it's foolish to say that, you know, all regulation is poor, or even in the majority of cases. It's really looking at what is the regulatory framework you're talking about, and is it incentivizing new jobs or protecting old jobs of a past century? And so in this domain, if we're talking about electrified and automated smart mobility for both human beings and freights, then there's a huge role that regulation needs to play. For example, classic example that motivated pre-current Trump era during the Obama administration, huge motivator for all things electric. CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards. Those standards, which under the Obama administration were doubled in stringency, right? Cars had to get double as efficient in a short period of time as they had been over 2012 emissions. That alone motivated the worldwide investment in hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and fully electrified vehicles. Without that, Tesla would not exist. So that is an example of a regulatory framework that still has weight, even though under the Trump administration, it's been watered down. So that regulatory framework created a global industry. And that actually, even if you go back further, when the corporate average fuel economy standards were created back in the 70s, that created the motivation for the first small engine vehicles in the 1980s. Now, at that time, it wasn't environmental policy. At that time, if you remember, OPEC oil crisis and the oil crisis around the world in the United States led to energy independency movements. That led to all of the Asian car makers entering the United States, small engine systems, small vehicles. So this is a great example where regulation literally creates a global industry. In Canada, we could easily look at, and the government has started at the federal level and even provincial levels, to look at setting zero emission standards. That doesn't mean, and it shouldn't mean, a certain number of cars sold. That I'm not a huge fan of, because I think it mistakes good regulation that spurs industry with a false target. What it needs to look at is emissions from the tailpipe and emissions life cycle. So however you get there, whether it's renewable natural gas, hydrogen, electrification, however innovators get there, it has to be that the regulation sets a certain emission standard. That spurs innovation across the whole supply chain, not just the vehicle, but the whole fueling supply chain.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hear that all the time from industry, and they, especially ones that oppose prescriptive regulations. They say, look, set the standards. We'll figure out how to meet those standards, and that's the best way to encourage investment from us to get, you know, to meet your goals, rather than telling us how to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I could add one thing, Mark, let's be frank, you know, an industry member is always going to be opposed to prescriptive regulatory targets when it's not in their interest. I've never seen a company lobby against a prescriptive target that is directly in their interest. So, you know, what I'd say is industry and across, you know, the academic utility pan spectrum of players in this ecosystem in Canada, generally there's a consensus that you don't want to pick a technology, but you do want to pick a target. Without a target, we're just a ship in the ocean with no port that we're aiming toward. So at least setting a target on emissions spurs the innovation through the supply chain to get to that target without privileging one particular technology over another.
Well, let's talk about some of the specific work that CUTRIC is doing. Could you give us an example of one of your areas of that you're working in?
Yeah, sure. So one of our marquee projects that took several years to get off the ground is our PanCanadian electric bus project. And that's a project that brings in Vancouver's TransLink with Brampton's Brampton Transit, and in York Region Transit. And those three transit agencies pooled together with manufacturers, so industry. The industry partners are New Flyer from Manitoba, Nova Bus from Quebec, Siemens, which is based here in Oakville, and ABB based in Montreal, and pooled them together with BC Hydro and Newmarket Tay Power Distribution, two utilities, to develop, design, deploy, and now monitor the first in the world electric bus standardization project. So what is this? 5 years ago, 6 years ago, even 3 years ago, if you wanted to buy electric buses as a city, you basically bought a type of bus that plugged into a certain type of charging system, and you were locked in. It was proprietary, it was not standardized, you couldn't mix and match. So no taxpayer likes being locked into monopolies. That's a statement of fact. And so there was a big problem in moving to these new technologies because everybody was locked into these proprietary designs. What we thought of was, what if we designed a project in Canada that for the first time in the world blew this open and forced standardization? which would allow any manufacturer to enter in the landscape, drive down costs for cities in the future, and get interoperable, mix and matchable buses and chargers out the door. We were able to achieve that. New Flyer Nova Bus put up their hand. Frankly, there were other manufacturers that said no at the time. They were making sales on proprietary tech. We had Canadian-based manufacturers say, we're willing to standardize. We will sink the money in redesigning. They did it. ABB and Siemens did it. They joined hands. It was not easy, but they did it. And these three cities, well, jurisdictions, TransLink, York Region, and Brampton, for the first time engaged in a national joint procurement effort. So we got 18 electric buses out the door, 7 overhead chargers, 5 routes, 3 cities, and they all mix and batch. So you have Nova buses and New Flyers on routes with ABB and Siemens chargers. First in the world, it's made Canada a mecca of electrification for heavy duty, and now we're logging everything. So also first time in the world, we insisted that every bus, every charger have a logger on it, all the data streams live, and we'll be streaming this year into a cloud platform so that each city can look at each other's buses and chargers in real time. And the whole idea is that the city then has more evidence to procure better, more efficiently, use fewer tax dollars in the future for more electrification and service deployment. That's an example of one of our projects. As an example of how it created jobs, Siemens has literally said we've had to hire people locally and create a team locally to accommodate this project. So you create more projects like this, you attract foreign direct investment by those global companies in the Canadian jurisdiction.
I want to talk about data for a moment, because I'm fascinated by this idea that the transit agencies will be sharing data. And the one thing I found in other aspects of the other areas of the energy industry is data is the king. And big data and analytics and artificial intelligence and machine learning really help to drive down costs, increase efficiencies across networks. And is that something that is a big issue, you know, on the bus transit side?
Yeah, well, you know, Mark, I'm a feminist, so I'm going to say analog was the king of the 20th century and data is the queen of the 21st century. So in reality, it is definitely data-driven solutions that are going to robustly enable electrification at a way lower cost than we had all expected. Because this stuff is expensive. Like, let's pull the wool from our eyes. This is very expensive. New capital investments, new operations, new type of laborers. None of this is going to be cheap. The payoff is over several years of operational and cost savings, healthcare, social good, all of that, right? So when we take a look at data, what it enables, especially transit agencies and cities to do, is for the first time start to compare and contrast. How are manufactured products actually behaving in your jurisdiction over time across 4 seasons of weather with your ridership and your topography and your impediments and starting and stopping? It basically gives cities a lot of power that they never had before. And in this regard, you know, when we started proposing this last year, saying, look, we're going to put loggers on everything. We're going to track everything, and we're going to let cities look at each other's data in real time, something that they philosophically always had the right to do, but never did because there just wasn't a cloud platform to do it in or a culture of doing it. The first response of many of our industry members was reticence. Certainly it was, this has never been so transparent before. And a lot of industry partners were not very keen on the idea that their clients could so quickly see so many details about how they performed across jurisdictions, because it's a new level of transparency and accountability. But every industry partner at CUTRIC has come around to accept that this is the way of the future. So it heightens performance requirements. It heightens the ability of cities to really demand better of the products and services and to know what's realistically possible. And it also heightens innovation, because you can take that data, feed it back to the manufacturer and help the manufacturer design a better product. That's the whole idea. Design a better system. You thought it would work like X, but it worked like Y. So here's the data you need to design a better system for Canadians.
Let's talk about another project, and this will be the last one, and then we'll open it up for questions. But in our previous interview, we had a really interesting discussion about how autonomous vehicles, and these would be like little mini buses or shuttles or some kind, could work with public transit systems to do the first mile and the last mile. And rather than autonomous vehicles that did all the miles, they would work in conjunction. I found that fascinating. So maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into CUTRIC's work in that area.
Sure. So this is our National Smart Vehicle Project. Single-handedly, it will be the most complex project I will ever have been a part of once it finally launches. And it's complicated for the following reasons. What we're talking about here are autonomous, driverless shuttles that are, as you say, like minibuses. They carry 6 to 20 people. This is, in our view, the future of autonomous driving. It's not single-passenger cars. It's shared mobility devices that connect people from LRT stations or GO bus stations or EXO stations in Montreal to their homes or the zoo or the science center or their commercial places of work, where right now the distance is maybe 1 to 3 kilometers. So it's too short to have a bus. It would be way too expensive for the agency to ever allocate a bus and a bus driver to such a short route. But it's long enough that people don't want to walk. Add in some -20 weather, even -10, heck, -5, and some snow and slush or a baby carriage. Nobody wants to walk 1,000 meters or 3,000 meters in high heels with a briefcase or a suit trying to get to work looking professional. So that first kilometer, last kilometer problem causes people to drive the whole way. It causes people to avoid the LRT, avoid the GO system or the transit system, avoid the rail system, because they can't get to that last point. These shuttles have an immense capability and possibility to deliver that last kilometer solution. Because they're driverless, the labor costs are very low to start with. Because you're applying them to routes that do not have buses, you are not competing with drivers. So you're not putting people out of work. You're relying on the backbone of the transit system that exists today, and then adding extra kilometers that driver-based buses can never deliver anyhow. They're smaller shuttles, so they're cheaper, and they're electrified, so their fuel is extremely cheap. They can also be deployed en route with a fixed schedule, which is how we're looking at starting it in dedicated laneway, but theoretically, and what we're trying to get to is deploying them off-piste or off-route. So in the hours of, say, 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, when there just aren't that many people trying to get to work or leave work, these things could theoretically be deployed on demand to go off-route, go pick up whoever needs to get picked up, go to the hospital, go to the shopping mall, go wherever they need to go, where normally they would call a more expensive help or mobility service or a taxi service. So there's a lot of possibility here in really extending the reach of the transit agency and frankly delivering a middle-class service. And I call it middle class because in Canada we often think of transit as like the place that poor people go. I don't have a car. I refuse to have a car because I take transit to see what the issues are. We have to treat transit like a middle-class service that people will pay a good penny for if it's a better service. And these autonomous shuttles give the possibility of really improving on-demand, immediate, on-time service for those first kilometer, last kilometer solutions.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go open it up for questions now. I see Ross has already got his hand up. So Ross, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Okay. Problem that I saw in Calgary is when I was working, I could get to work in about 25 minutes by transit, but that was downtown. Yeah. At the time, my son was going to college and it took him 2 hours to get to a college, which was actually distance-wise closer than downtown. And the problem that I'm seeing, of course, and it's repeated all over North America, is that we have a city that's developed for cars and has a bunch of urban sprawl, but the transit system has a hard time adapting to this. What do you do about that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a huge question, right? There's a lot packed in there. And as a Calgarian myself, I have to say, I mean, I grew up taking the bus from Marlborough Park to downtown to Calgary, where I went to high school. And it was an hour and a half every day. It was a bus plus an LRT plus an LRT plus a long walk through a wind tunnel that broke your cheeks in freezing cold weather, or another bus. And that was just to get to school and back every single day. Ironically, Calgary Transit is probably one of the most innovative transit systems in this country. Technologically, they've always been at the cutting edge. Problematically, Calgary, like a lot of North American cities, is not restrained by the boundary conditions of the medieval era that have restrained a lot of European and other global cities and forced extreme density in the urban core. And so Calgary is a great example of a city that has spread out very, very widely, making it hugely difficult for transit to deliver service at anything like a break-even level out to communities that are miles and kilometers out of the downtown core. So the question then is, how do we undo a car-based culture in urban design that's been built up since the post-war era, focusing primarily on the liberty of individual passenger car ownership and road usage out to the middle of nowhere that enables low-cost housing ownership? I don't have all the tools, but certainly one of the tools that we've long advocated for is road pricing. government has two tools: incentives and disincentives. We can either punish people or we can incentivize them to do better. That's pretty much the toolkit that government has. And for about the last 15 years, most of our levels of government in Canada, like elsewhere, have tried to get people to be more environmental, reduce consumption, grow into density through incentivizing things. But the reality is, as I've said many times before, I don't think as Canadians we really care that much about the environment. At least we don't care enough to give up our car or our big homes or the liberty of the roads that connect us between suburban communities. We only start to care when it hits us in the pocketbook. And road pricing is a critical policy there. Imagine in Calgary that as soon as you get on the Deerfoot, you are charged $2 per kilometer. Immediately, that would change behavior. Immediately, where do you live? Do you take the car? Do you drop the kids off with a car? Do you better organize your schedule? Do you live in a smaller quarter more densely? Road pricing has a huge opportunity to drive density closer, which would then allow transit to deliver a service that's incomparable, or that is comparable rather, with cars. So without road pricing, we just will not have the drive toward density that's required in order to compete with cars. I think, Markham, you may be muted.
I was. I will unmute my own mic. So Dave, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Sure. Great presentation. Thank you. About 3 months ago, Bombardier decided to sell off its rail division. I sent a few emails to our politicians saying, we bailed them out for $4 billion since the 60s. We just spent $4.5 billion on a pipeline to the sea. Surely we can come up with another $4 billion and own this amazing asset. I don't know if it's viable. You would know this stuff. I live rural, so inner city stuff. I know we're at Vancouver for the 2010 Olympics. It was awesome. You walk 10 minutes, get a train, whatever, you could go. But I'm looking at more sort of the 1,000-kilometer thing. And how can we possibly let Bombardier get rid of its rail division when we need thousands of kilometers of light rail transportation?
Yeah, so again, a lot of questions packed in there. I'll try and break it into two. One is, I hear your question deeply because Bombardier actually sits on our board of directors. They are represented at our board of directors because the transportation aspect of it in terms of heavy duty rail is a huge people mover. And we all know there's not nearly enough passenger-based rail in this country. Add to that the fact that Bombardier actually over the last decades developed a world innovative inductive charging system called PrimeMove, which is now being developed in France and not in Kingston in Ontario or in Montreal where Bombardier is headquartered. So the bigger question is not necessarily do we need to buy it out, and do we need to nationalize it, or do we need to save the company in its current formulation? But in its buyout, which has occurred with Alstom taking over those assets, the question is, can we make sure that those Bombardier R&D manufacturing assets remain in Canada? Because whether it's called Bombardier or Alstom, in a globalized world, is it Hydrogenics or Cummins? Well, now it's Cummins. And, when you take a look at globalization, there's going to be a lot of mergers and acquisitions. And the name actually does not matter. At the end of the day, is it the Canadian legacy of Bombardier, or is it now called Alstom? Doesn't matter. What really matters are all those thousands of jobs. Are they going to go off to Europe, be re-centralized into Germany and into the R&D sectors in the European centers where Alstom practices, or will Alstom maintain them here in Ontario and Quebec? And that is our job at CUTRIC, to make sure that Bombardier capacities stay here, because then those jobs stay here. And then that innovation stays here, and then it's local and domestic and can be integrated into our services. So in a globalized world, our job is to make sure that those purchases and asset acquisitions do not result in the offshoring of that intellectual talent, which results in job loss. We want to make sure that it stays here.
Okay, Raf, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hello. So firstly, I would like to just comment on the Ross questions about the public transport in the cities. So some cities have well-organized the public transport. Like I lived in Montreal, never owned a car there. I used bicycle and subway, and taking subway on the peak hours was actually faster and cheaper than getting stuck on the bridge and then looking for parking and paying for parking. So some cities do have well-organized systems. But my question is, what do you think about this Hyperloop project? Is it nonsense? What do you think? What's your opinion on that?
Well, first thing I would say is that, you know, as Canadians, we demand better, and we should always demand better. But actually, our transit systems in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are actually quite good. You know, we do have it good, and all you have to do is leave the country to know how poor transit can be in large urban centers. But it can always be better. So to echo your point, you know, it could be even faster than it is today. Having said that, is Hyperloop the solution? So we actually looked into Hyperloop over the last couple years. The idea of what a Hyperloop is, basically, minus the technology, it's basically a very, very, very fast hyper mobility system that moves a lot of people over a very long distance very quickly in a cost-effective and efficient manner. Is there a future for it? Yeah, there is a future for high-frequency rail, high-speed rail, and hyperspeed rail. Whether it's going to be levitated on the exact magnetic structure that the Hyperloop is organized around, and the vacuum tube structure that is organized around, that I can't tell you. There's a lot of money being pumped into it right now, that I can tell you. Will there be something like superconducting potential for hyper-fast trains? Yes, that already exists. But do we need Hyperloop to solve our problems? No. What we actually need is on-time high-frequency rail to start, and then some additional sidings on our rail network to ensure that CPCN do not block via rail. That alone would radically innovate our rail sector in this country without having to wait for Hyperloop to come around. But I'm quite optimistic that Hyperloop is a 21st century type of solution. It may not look exactly as it does in the mock-ups right now, but something that is extraordinarily fast and competes with aerospace or airplane travel is, I think, critical, especially in this day and age when people do not want to be cloistered in a flying bus in the air with insufficient air conditioning. So I do think there's a future for it in the 21st century, not necessarily in the next 10 years.
Okay, Maggie, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Well, this has been awesome. Great information. So I've been thinking about shared autonomous electric vehicles, but separate. And maybe you don't even need long distance trains and buses in the city if that system worked really well. It would mean that there's probably 60% of the cars would go away. It would mean that in the wintertime, or not in the winter, at nighttime, those things would run around and deliver packages, perhaps. They wouldn't need to be parked anywhere. And I don't know, I think the cost of having that kind of system would go to about 1/10 of car ownership. So I'm just wondering if you would compare and contrast those two systems in your mind as to advantages and disadvantages of those two things.
Yeah, well, first thing I would say is there's definitely, I agree with you, definitely a role for shared electric autonomous vehicles that are the size of, say, a Honda Civic or a Ford Focus. You know, that type of vehicle size that fits 4 to 5 people and a chunk of packages for local delivery, that has a place, especially if we think in the classic carpooling sense, that if we can make the service work well, whether it's publicly or privately delivered, that people would avoid their cars, leave their cars at home, and basically carpool in these autonomous, on-demand, electrified vehicles that are just small shuttles. So I agree with you that there's an opportunity there. The disadvantage is it will never, even if you have them all moving at exactly the same speed, optimized distances from one another, zero traffic accidents, even in those scenarios, they will never move as many people as buses, coaches, or trains. So there's a place for them, but can they displace buses, coaches, and trains? When we're talking about moving thousands of people over a certain distance, there is no replacement for trains, buses, and coaches. The capacity is simply enormous when you combine those mobility modes. And one might say, yeah, but Canada's not, you know, a global epicenter of population growth. We don't necessarily need the hyper fast trains of China because we don't have 1.4 billion people. We have way fewer people in a much larger expanse. That is true for the bulk of Canada. And so building rail lines or coach lines or bus lines does not make sense in all communities. From an investment perspective, these autonomous shared shuttles may make a lot more cost sense. But in the cities that are aiming to become global cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, there is no replacement for buses, coaches, and trains. Toronto is a great example. If we want to be the global city of 10 million people plus, there is no possible way to do it, even if you get people optimized in car sharing and there's 5 people per vehicle. The Gardner and the QEW are breaking down, and they will continue to break down even even with that kind of optimization. So there's going to have to be a combination of rail, bus, coach, and autonomous shuttles that can be optimized on demand in local communities. The end is that nothing about our mobility system today is sufficient. It's not sufficient for today, let alone 10 years from now. If it were sufficient, people wouldn't be complaining about the congestion, the time loss, the loss and breakdowns in the subway, the time lost in the parking lot that is the QEW half the time. People would not be complaining about those things. Go over to Calgary, same kinds of complaints. Over to Edmonton, same kinds of complaints. Over to Vancouver, same complaints. So the system's not working. And therefore, autonomous driverless shuttles have a play, but they cannot replace the mass mobility of trains and buses. It's just a volume question.
Josipa, I've got a follow-up question for you on that. It looks to me like we're sort of redesigning our mobility models, and we're doing it at the personal level, where some, a family might have two vehicles, and one of them might be now they're thinking about an electric for commuting and so on, and they might have a gas car for long distance trips, that sort of thing. But it looks like we're also doing it at the national level, the provincial level, the urban level, where it's now a mix of different options to get people where they need to go in a more timely fashion and a more cost-effective fashion. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I would say things are in transition. COVID-19 has thrown things into even more disruptive transition, and we can all add in the layer of people now considering things they never thought was even feasible in terms of their commuting behavioral pattern. I see this as a huge opportunity, but if I were to rewind to the starting base point of your query, Markham, prior to COVID, what was happening? Well, some households were starting to make a decision about, do I need my SUV that uses gas for every single trip I make? Or should I have a second car that's maybe a little hybrid, a Prius C, or even electric car for my putt-putt little things that go around town, or my trips to soccer or hockey? Is that possible? Some households were starting to make that decision, and you could see it in the growth in hybrid sales, plug-in hybrid sales, and electric car sales. But I reiterate that some households were also economically privileged households. It is expensive to own a car in this country, even a used one. It's extremely expensive to own an electrified car. Usually implies that you own a house, which usually implies you're in a certain economic bracket. And while Canadians may feel dragged down by their household debt, there is still no doubt that you must be earning a reasonably good paycheck, or estimate and predict that you will be so, if you're making a decision about having two cars to start with. So there was that movement. The car sales were demonstrating it. The sale of charging systems at homes were starting to demonstrate it. And a little bit of the legislation in British Columbia and Ontario, where condo developers were increasingly being required to install charging units in parkades, that was starting to show it. But that alone, if we rely on that, we're never going to get to our Paris climate commitments or household transformations, because the question of owning the car is the first and foremost problem to start with. And there I do say, I have two tests. One is the simple test of me, and one is my sister. What am I? I don't own a car. And when I did own a car, I owned an electric car. I live downtown. I don't have kids, and I earn a good income. All of those things combined allow me to take transit anywhere, all times, because I don't have to run to daycare. I don't have a husband at home waiting for me. I don't have to cook anybody's meal but my own. And I earn a good enough income that if I get stuck somewhere, I know I can call for help and I'll get out of wherever I am. Okay, that cannot be the litmus test for electrification or transit in this country. The litmus test has to be my sister with her husband in Chestermere, 2 kids, no bus service to downtown Calgary, even though she'd like to take transit to her job in downtown Calgary, not possible to do. Even if you get to the rapid line, you still have to drive and fight for a parking spot, and it's once every 30 minutes, can't get to the daycare, can't get to the sports arenas. You cannot have a family in Chestermere that is transit-based, not possible. So until we are enabling a system that allows my sister with her 2 kids in Chestermere to be transit-based, we haven't solved the problem in Canada. The household decision of 2 cars, yeah, they have hybrids, so that's a good plus, but it's not going to solve Canada's emissions problem or our mobility and congestion problem.
Okay, Tony, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please. Tony.
There we go. Josipa, this is fascinating stuff. I live in a small to medium-sized city called Red Deer, about 100,000 people. It's not Toronto or Vancouver. Nevertheless, our city planners are determined to make the same mistakes of Los Angeles and all those other places, lots of sprawl. The idea of the autonomous, last mile shuttles is fascinating. Would that be a game changer for our pathetic transit system?
Well, first of all, I love Red Deer, spent a lot of time in Red Deer, drove through Red Deer a lot. And at one point in our history, Red Deer, the city of Red Deer and Red Deer Transit were members of CUTRIC. And we even did modeling for them showing the operational cost savings of going electric. So I would say that to their great credit, there are people who are innovative, certainly leading in the transit industry, looking for solutions. The challenge that Red Deer faces, like a lot of towns and cities of the size of Red Deer in this country, is the ridership is not high enough to justify the kind of client-driven, revenue-driven technology innovation with transit on its own. So one of the solutions that is quite obvious for a lot of these mid-sized and smaller sized cities and towns is going to smaller vehicles. Like, why are we fixated on the 40-foot bus when the 40-foot bus is not full to start with, right? So looking at the smaller shuttles, the smaller buses, and the on-demand electrified driverless shuttles is a clear solution for those kinds of communities. Where do you have to start? Because you can't have it all today. Well, if we think about autonomous driving, there's 5 levels, and level 5 is the car, the vehicle can go anywhere, anytime, under any condition. But you don't actually need that for transit deployments. You need level 4, and level 4 is available today where it's on dedicated laneway. And on dedicated laneway, the driverless shuttles, the autonomous shuttles, go from point A to point B to point C and deliver a service that's on demand or on fixed schedule that is rapid and frequent at a fraction of the cost of a bus and the whole service around buses. So to keep buses where they are is a good start, but then to supplement them with driverless on-demand shuttles with dedicated or semi-dedicated laneway is a clear winner. And in terms of semi-dedicated and dedicated laneway, people think, well, that means you're cutting into road space. Well, at some point, we're gonna have to make a decision about, is our road space only for cars? So if we wanna move people and we wanna move them fast and we wanna move them cheaply, at some point, we're gonna have to share the road. And what does a dedicated laneway look like? Well, we have dedicated bicycle lanes all over the place. It's not a huge amount of infrastructure. It does mean that you're dedicating some markers so the shuttle knows to go on these routes and not to divert off into what could be mixed traffic. But the infrastructure is a fraction, a tiny fraction of what it costs to lay track for LRT or streetcars, and a fraction of what it costs to buy 40-foot buses. So it's possible to do. Some of the technologies involved are magnets in roads, light markers in roads, and then simply put, lower speeds. So if you have shuttles that operate consistently at 20 to 30 kilometers an hour, even 15 to 20 kilometers an hour, low speed, they can operate on scooter lanes, bicycle lanes, and share it with other smaller mobility modes. That is possible to do today in a city like Red Deer. It takes some leadership and takes some knowledge, and to be fair to folks in Red Deer, like around the country, not everybody, is at the cutting edge of knowing all the technologies available out there. And to be fair, the technology is not perfectly ready right now. So if a city like Red Deer wanted to enter into it, they'd have to be entering into like a demonstration project where they'd be willing to take that some things are going to go wrong. For the next couple of years, some things will go wrong. It won't work perfectly, but that's how you get from where we are to where we want to be, which is a way better mobility system.
Okay, Sergio, you're up next. If you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
First of all, thank you so much. It's an amazing presentation. I really like these new words I'm learning about. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the yellow bus and this idea about schools and how, for me, right away, the idea of this concept of opportunity and having the right tools in place to expand. Always these new schools are coming on board with these ideas of how to create funding on off hours, how to create these concepts as to supporting the kids with new tools and new. So I see this as a habit issue right now, because you have to learn to break out of your current habits because of, for whatever reason, you think it's faster or more convenient. So I was thinking on the terms of, if we support this concept of a school bus system, we are creating new habits with the students, as well as having opportunities for the new schools for, I would say, like charging stations that parents could fundraise to create different funding charging stations available.
Could you ask your question, please? We'll just.
Sorry. The question is, what are the new programs for the yellow bus programs, if there are any, with schools?
Yeah, so the first thing is Canada is a leader in electric school bus manufacturing. Sorry, I think I accidentally muted myself. Sorry about that. So Canada is a leader in electric school bus manufacturing. It's out of Quebec. Lion Electric School Bus has been making electric school buses for many years and having great deal of success in Quebec and California in getting those school buses out the door. Now, truth be told, a lot of those sales are heavily, heavily subsidized by the state. So right now, just to give perspective, if you think about a 40-foot transit bus, a diesel bus is about $500,000, an electric is $1.1 million. Electric school bus, similar. You can look at double to triple the price of a diesel. So no surprise, it's very hard to go electric when it costs that much up front and your savings rise over 10 years of operations, because electricity is way cheaper as a fuel, as is hydrogen, way cheaper as a fuel than diesel or gasoline can be over the life cycle of the vehicle. But it's hard to buy now when the savings is 15 years out. In the school bus domain, it's even harder, because in the transit domain, the city has taxpayers for years to come. The city knows it has taxpayers and an operational budget for years to come, so it can bank on 10 years from now. School buses are typically private fleets, right? And a lot of them in Canada are mom and pop shops. We have a couple school bus fleet operators that are mega operators with hundreds of buses that deliver to lots of schools, but lots of them are just a few routes, a few schools, mom and pop shops. So how are they going to afford $1 million school buses? In those cases, and in a lot of cases, for the purpose of saving children's health and reducing the noxious materials that are currently in the air, in the school bus that kids are on, electrification makes a lot of healthcare sense. And so subsidizing school buses is something that I am supportive of, at least in the short term, because the long-term savings in child health. But once you get to beyond the initial subsidization, the cost savings are enormous over the 5, 10, 15-year period. So it's possible to set up a subsidization program that has a payoff back to the government over 10 to 15 years as the bus pays itself off. Now, to the second point of your question, the cost savings won't only be from electricity over diesel, because the school buses don't move that much, right? In the morning, they deliver kids, and in the afternoon, they pull kids back. They have very fixed routes. They're not on the road 24 hours a day like transit buses. So your savings are slower because your operations are fewer. What could you fill up the day with? Absolutely, on-demand delivery. This is something that's been discussed for transit too, at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, at 11 o'clock at night, when there's not that many people on the vehicle or children on the school bus. Could the bus be redeployed as a delivery vehicle so that the school bus operator makes a buck by delivering some Amazon packages? Yes, it is possible to do. Has it been done? No, not en masse, certainly, and not in pilot projects in Canada. Could it be done and should it be done? Yes, in particular if tied to a subsidization program for the electrification of school buses. I would say there's more opportunity in the school bus domain because the labor workforce typically is not unionized. For good or for bad, that does mean you have the ability to grow new skill sets and ask drivers to do things that are not currently, say, in a collective agreement. Where you have a collective agreement, you have a little bit more parameter control, and it will take a little bit longer to get new roles baked into it. So there's the possibility of dynamically innovating the labor force along with on-demand service delivery. And last, I will mention the fact that if you do electrify school buses, boy, do you have a science project for students to learn from. I've heard loads of principals talk about the idea that if we could have a charger in an electric school bus at our school, we would have grade 6 students and grade 9 students study the buses and the chargers and learn about energy from these vehicles because it's real, they're on them, and it would start creating not just the labor class of the future, but inspiring kids to believe that this technologically cool stuff that is part of their life is normal and that anything else is not normal, and they can build a career around it and become inculcated into it at a very young age in science learning. A lot of benefits to electrified school busing.
Okay, Dave Patterson, this will be the last question, and if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Hi, great presentation, great information. I'm wondering how, rapid or express buses could fit in as alternative to, light rapid transit.
Yeah, I love this question. I love this question because I'm a huge fan of the possibility that electrified and autonomous rapid transit buses could replace or at least delay the need for investment into LRT. Now, I'm a huge fan of LRT. I'm a fan of any transit. More transit is better than no transit, so don't get me wrong about it. But investing in LRT is multiple years, light rail transit. It takes a lot of infrastructure investment. You often have to buy out roads and buy out houses to create the pathways. It creates a lot of community dialogue and often debate and opposition. And in Ontario, of course, we just saw the big debacle with Hamilton light rail transit getting unfunded by the current government after being funded by the previous government, and the kind of discombobulation that causes and what will transit look like in the future. So rapid transit ways, bus rapid transit ways, are a huge trendy topic of North America right now. We have long distances, high speeds, generally lower ridership than Europe. So how do you move a lot of people without building a rail system on day one? You move it with a bunch of buses on dedicated laneway that operate in 30-second to 1-minute increments of each other. You basically have a rail system without rail tracks on wheels. And if you can electrify it, it's as cheap operationally as an electric train, even cheaper because it's lighter weight. It moves and can move as many people. And you have the dynamic ability to reroute certain paths if communities develop in the 5 to 10 year period after that in a way that you didn't expect. New condos go up, new parks are established. So you have the ability to reroute in a way that tracks don't allow you to do very easily. If you then add some automation, and you enable, for example, the electric buses when on the rapid transit way to speak to each other in a connected fashion and be automated and mostly driverless, then you will get optimized distances, say 30 seconds to a minute between each other, and safe distances that drivers cannot achieve. But once the bus comes off the rapid transit way, the driver takes over. So you have a system that enables rapid transit on a dedicated laneway, and the bus can still come off the dedicated laneway with the driver on board to operate in regional community areas where the automation wouldn't work because it's mixed traffic. It's very dynamic, it's much lower cost, the systems exist today, and it can be electrified tomorrow. So I'm a very big fan of it. It just hasn't had as much appeal in Canada, and part of that's just cultural, how we've done our transit in the past. And yet bus rapid transit way is definitely a solution for the 21st century.
Well, thank you very much. This has been great. This is one of our most successful Zoffies, I think. Josipa, thank you very much. I always enjoy chatting with you, and no doubt we'll be doing it again in the future. And thank you very much for coming out today. Thanks, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Have a great holiday Monday.
Indeed.